We've all watched the unfolding drama this week in Nashville, Tennessee, as an active shooter at Covenant Christian School killed 3 9-year-old children and 3 adult staffers at the school. How do we think biblically about what is an unusual school shooting, a complex mix of ideas? The media has lots of things to say, almost none of them helpful. How do we process? Covenant School in Nashville this week saw a shooter that broke through glass doors and came in, and in 14 minutes before the Nashville Police Department could respond, killed 6 people. The Nashville PD arrived and eventually killed the shooter. But what complicates this issue is that this shooter, unlike what we've grown accustomed to in such instances, this shooter was a biological woman who claimed transgender status and identified on social media as a male. That single element of this issue has complicated the way that we can process. We're always looking for motives because there's something about being created in the image of God that makes random evil inconceivable. We always have this impulse that needs to know why somebody did what they did. The problem here is the why, in this instance, is sort of papered over by the ideological agendas that are present right now in our culture. And so to talk about such issues is only done publicly within certain strict and politically correct boundaries. I've grappled this week on how to think biblically about this issue that's in the headlines of our news right now. And I just want to share some of my process of how I'm trying to come to grips with this and how I can apply the Word of God to an understanding of what has happened. First of all, part of this consequence is a result of what I would call the normalization of evil action in our culture. For example, the shooter was described in some of the very earliest news reports as, in one of the first police reports, for example, the shooter was described as a biological woman who identifies as a man, a transgender man, with no previous history of mental illness. Now, here's the problem. While there are some who participate in the transgender movement who are obviously just sort of reveling in the anti-establishment rebellion of it all, who are cross-dressing and doing things like that because they love the attention, they love sort of swimming upstream against traditional culture at large. The fact of the matter is, while there's always that element of people who just want to be different and they just want to stand out, the fact of the matter is most transgenders suffer from what is called gender dysphoria, which has always been classified as a mental health issue. I think it's clear, the more we find out about this shooter, that the struggles that she experienced qualify as actual gender dysphoria. So by definition, she was struggling from mental illness. She was not mentally healthy. But because of our ideological parameters, we have to stand up and say, well, this shooter had no history of mental illness. See, what we've done there semantically is we've normalized evil action. It doesn't matter how often or how completely transgenderism is celebrated in the media or on TikTok. It is a medical condition needing treatment just like depression, schizophrenia, or any other mental health issue. But because we can't say that, me saying that right now is somehow a radical action in our contemporary culture. By not identifying faulty mental processing for what it is, mental unhealthiness, we have in effect now normalized evil action, and that leaves us sort of floating on an iceberg out in the middle of the ocean with no reference point now. I mean, if there's no way to connect action to cause, then this becomes a truly difficult event to understand, because with no mental illness involved, now we're only left with the conclusion that this was an expression of pure and unadulterated evil. Well, I don't think the transgender community wants that conclusion to be put forth. In fact, the normalization of evil action has produced, particularly within the progressive left, the next part of this that I've been trying to process, and that is we've gone from normalizing evil action to justifying evil action. For example, I've heard numerous reports of people giving lip service to the pain and the suffering of families that have lost children, while immediately following that sort of obligatory, "oh, we're sorry this happened" comment, with some sort of explanation about why this really wasn't the shooter's fault. One writer on social media said, well, you've got to factor in the pain of a bad childhood. Well, I'm sorry, I don't care. Your bad childhood does not justify cold-blooded murder. In fact, the social media influencer who made the comment that, well, you have to factor in the bad childhood, that person's comment was stupid enough. But then I'll call him by name, Mike Wise, and the reason I mention him is because he's actually a Washington Post contributor. He writes on the editorial page of one of the most influential newspapers in America. In his Twitter account, he retweeted this comment about the pain of childhood and completely affirmed it as a justifiable explanation of why these things had to happen. Well, he's not the only one. Others have said, well, it's a natural consequence of political conflict. The state of Tennessee has recently passed legislation outlawing drag queen story hours in front of children. And their statement is, well, what do you expect would happen when the government outlaws these drag queen story hours? You had to expect it. Had to expect what? What other law is passed in America that we see the law pass and then we go, oh, well, people are going to start shooting each other down in the streets, and it just is what it is. You see how crazy it is that we've moved from normalizing evil to now justifying evil. We say, well, she was bullied in school growing up. She's a victim of hurtful words. Again, I don't care. We need to help her. We need to help her work through her mental health issues. We need to fight against the problem of children bullying children. But none of that can possibly justify cold-blooded murder. You say, well, it was an outlier. It's just an extraordinary, unfortunate example. No, it's not an outlier. There's an organization called the Trans Resistance Network. They issued a statement this week in response to this. I want to read you part of it. They said, the first tragedy today, speaking about this event, is the loss of 3 children and adults. We extend our deepest sympathies and heartfelt prayers to those families dealing with the loss of loved ones. There's nothing we can offer that will comfort the hurt or ease the sorrow. We mourn with you. The statement should have stopped right there, but it doesn't. It says, speaking now about the shooter, It says, we do not claim to know the individual or have access to their inner thoughts and feelings. We do know that life for transgender people is very difficult and made more difficult in the preceding months by a virtual, this is a quote, by a virtual avalanche of anti-trans legislation and public call-outs by right-wing personalities and political figures for nothing less than the genocidal eradication of trans people from society. Did you hear that? Where have you seen anybody on the right or anywhere else calling for the genocide of trans people? Is that not a hyperbole used to justify the murder of 6 people? They say most transgender people deal with anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide, and PTSD. Okay, we would expect that because they're suffering from mental illness, but that's not the explanation given here. They say they deal with all of these problems from the near constant drumbeat of anti-trans hate, lack of acceptance from family members and certain religious institutions, denial of our existence, and calls for detransition and forced conversion. There are no reputable leaders in America calling for the forced conversion of people with gender dysphoria. In fact, it's just the opposite. We're inviting the culture to take mental illness seriously and begin to try and help people rather than what is now euphemistically referred to as gender affirming care, like your gender needs affirmation. Gender affirming care is a euphemism that describes the ability for us to relabel mental illness and pretend like it doesn't exist. And by not helping people suffering from mental illness, we've now not just normalized evil action, but we've justified it. This weekend in Washington, D.C., there is what is being promoted as the Trans Day of Vengeance. They are gathering transgender supporters are gathering outside the Supreme Court to protest. I'm fine with protests, but just the language, a day of vengeance, does that not sound like a justification of evil action? You see, I used to hear people say, how many more children need to die? And it was said in a way that seemed to imply a despair, that something was broken that needs to be fixed. But I hear it with a different tone now. I hear people saying, how many more children need to die? And it's beginning to me to sound like a threat. We've normalized evil action. Now we've justified that evil action. This woman who suffered from the delusions that she was a man, she needed help. But we so lovingly affirmed her delusions, and because she couldn't live within the false reality that she had created for herself, she snapped and she killed 6 people. Well, there's a whole element in our culture that says, well, it's the problem is guns. The problem is guns. I mean, we got to get rid of guns. Listen, I'm so tired of this argument. Here's the reality. Do you know that there are approximately 400 million guns in the United States? If guns themselves were the problem, there would already be none of us left. That's not the problem. The problem is evil in the human heart and mental illness left untreated because of political ideology. Well, how do we process this? Well, in the 2nd chapter of the book of Exodus, we find the people of God are in slavery in Egypt. And there's an interesting verse at the end of 2nd chapter, verses 23 through 25, and it says, "Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry for help because of their bondage ascended to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them." 4 things there. God heard the groaning of his people. We need to cry out to God because we now live in a world where truth is not even a part of the equation, where the normal standards that allow civilized society to exist are no longer kept in place. We need to cry out to God because we are in desperate straits. Our culture is dying. Our nation will not last another generation on this path. We need to cry out to God. That's what they did. But when God's people cried out, it said he heard their groaning. We can trust that God hears us. He remembered his covenant. That is, God recognizes and remembers his relationship to his children. And God saw the sons of Israel. He was aware. He knew what they were going through. And he took notice of them. There's got to be encouragement here for us. We have to turn our eyes and our prayers and our cries to God, because honestly, there is not one politician in America that I trust to fix this. You say, oh, I'm a Donald Trump supporter, or I'm a Ron DeSantis supporter, or whatever. Listen, salvation and spiritual awakening are not going to arrive on Air Force One. We need to cry out to God. But when we do, we have the confidence that he knows what we're going through, and he's aware of his love and obligation toward us as his children. In Psalm 46, verses 10 and 11, it says this: "Stop striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted on the earth. The Lord of armies is with us." That's our prayer. We need to pray for these families that have suffered loss. We need to pray for this school and the trauma of all the children that attend there. We need to pray for the families that have lost these adult staffers in that school. We need to pray for those that were close to the shooter, especially if they're suffering from the same common mental illness struggles that she obviously was. But here's what we need to do most of all. We need to be still and know that the God of armies is on our side. He will be honored among the nations. Even so, Lord Jesus, come quickly. This is Truth Currents.